Luxembourg, January 1945. Snow hit the armor like handfuls of nails. The air vibrated with the growl of engines and the distant percussion of artillery somewhere beyond the frozen ridge. Down in the valley, 3 American companies were pinned, infantry caught between 2 Panthers and the carcass of a burning bridge. Inside my M18 Hellcat, the metal stung against my gloves. I kept one hand pressed to the turret wall, feeling the tremor of the idling engine through the steel. Through the periscope, the white landscape flickered with orange, men crawling, muzzle flashes, smoke. The order on my map was clear: hold position. The radio cracked with static, then a voice from battalion, flat, remote. Hold position. No smoke. Under my elbow lay a single white phosphorus shell, marked in stenciled letters, SMK, not for field use. If I obeyed, they'd die. If I disobeyed, so would we, only slower. I looked at the shell, at the snow, at the valley dissolving into firelight. And I asked myself the question that still wakes me decades later. How did it come to this? We belonged to the 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, 3rd Army, Patton's cold right hand along the Luxembourg border. Paper said we were mobile, aggressive, decisive. The snow said otherwise. Tracks froze into rutted scars, radios coughed, bearings shrieked when the temperature fell below 10. We fought from an open-topped M18, thin armor, wide eyes, a 76mm G*N that spoke clean when the breech ran dry and the oil stayed warm. The engine behind us was a Continental radial, 9 cylinders muttering through the hull, smelling of leaded fuel and wet canvas. Speed was our armor, doctrine said so. Doctrine also said this: white phosphorus was for illumination and marking only. Never for concealment. The phrasing survived 2 revisions of the field manual and 3 changes of staff at battalion. The logic looked tidy on a chalkboard. WP burned hot, wandered with wind, blinded spotters, drifted back over friendlies. A smokescreen that thought for itself. In classrooms they called that unacceptable risk. But classrooms had roofs. On our ridge, the system flowed the wrong direction. Information rose slowly, orders fell late. Artillery nets chattered, the forward observers swore their lines were clean. We sat on SCR 508s that sounded like hail in a tin bucket. Say again became ritual. I learned to read the valley with a periscope and a wristwatch instead of a map and permission. Every morning, the adjutant's jeep left division with fresh mimeographs, arrows, phase lines, tabulated distances to a bridge that had already burned. They reached us at noon, still damp with purple ink. By then the valley had changed names. We penciled corrections into the margins until the paper looked like a winter field, scuffed and torn and walked over by the wrong boots. The anti-smoke order hardened exactly when we needed flexibility. Some battalion had gassed itself under an inversion 2 sectors south, rumor inflated it into doctrine. The phrase appeared in fragmentary orders, then in briefings, then carved into us by repetition: no smoke, repeat, no smoke. No one removed it because no one wanted the responsibility of removing it. Responsibility weighed more than men in that season. I was a platoon leader with 4 Hellcats, each carrying thin hope and 28 rounds in the ready rack. Armor-piercing, high-explosive and the awkward orphans, illumination, WP, kept for marking because the book said so. The crews understood the book. They also understood winter. Powder burned sluggish in cold chambers, fuses lied, grease turned to chalk if it missed the heat of a hand. We warmed shells under our coats, not because it helped much but because doing nothing was worse. Our battalion commander measured risk in pages. He had survived North Africa by obeying the arithmetic. I respected that. So did the men. But the bulge changed the math. German armor moved like weather, arriving, not assembling. When fog closed the sky, air support inbound became a prayer we said with a straight face. The only tools left were angle, distance, and nerve, and a shell we were told to ignore. On patrol rosters I wrote wind directions in the margin and circled them twice. WP would ride that wind as faithfully as any doctrine. At 12 knots from northeast, a single airburst could fill a river bend and fold over the far bank like cloth. At 8, it would hang and boil. At 4, it would betray us and crawl back uphill. None of that lived in the manual. It lived at the lip of a turret in January, where breath froze on the sight and a man could taste his own silence. So the system said, hold. The valley said, move. Between those two orders, men died. And in the narrow space where they died, a decision waited. My name is Lieutenant Ray Collier. Before the uniforms and the snow, before the coordinates and the dead air between transmissions, I built hydraulic pumps in Wichita. Machines were simple then, cause and effect, pressure and release. If something failed, you traced the fault, replaced the part, recalibrated. No heroics, no mystery. Only ratios, tolerances, the quiet certainty that every problem carried its own geometry. I lived alone above a machine shop that smelled of cutting oil and hot iron. Evenings, I'd eat at a diner that kept the lights too bright, sketching pump schematics on napkins while the waitress called me Blueprint. The name stuck. Precision was my defense against the chaos of everything else. I believed in measurement the way priests believe in grace, as a guarantee that the world could still be made right if only you held the right numbers. When war came, I enlisted because paper felt small. The factory was safe, efficient, but I wanted proof that all the engineering I worshipped could withstand the unplanned. The recruiter said the army needed men who could think mechanically. I signed, thinking I'd fix tanks in depots. Instead, they taught me to command them. Officer training broke me out of equations. They taught us terrain, formations, radio procedure. They taught us certainty, and I took to it easily. But underneath the salutes and formulas, I could feel how fragile it all was. Order depended on agreement, one wire of belief stretched through too many men. At Fort Benning, I learned G*Nary on the M10, then graduated to the new M18 Hellcat. Fastest tracked vehicle in Europe, they said, up to 55 miles an hour on good ground. I memorized its anatomy like scripture. Continental R975 radial engine, 9 cylinders, air-cooled, 400 horsepower, 76mm M1A2 cannon with a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. A thin-skinned miracle that could outrun what it couldn't outshoot. Speed instead of armor. Logic instead of protection. I trusted that logic because it was measurable. Kansas followed me to Europe in habits. I still wrote dates and times in the corners of letters home, down to the minute, as if precision could keep my mother from reading between the lines. I kept a notebook of pressures and recoil values in my breast pocket long after training ended. When something jammed, I fixed it by the math, not by prayer. My crew joked that I tightened bolts with a slide rule. But Normandy stripped the varnish off the numbers. Mud clogged everything, air filters, fuses, lungs. I saw what happened when formulas met fear. A machine obeyed, but men stalled, panicked, broke formation. In one village near St. Lo, G*Ner froze mid-reload. The German shell that hit us afterward tore through the right side of the hull. The fire took him, not the blast. I spent the night calculating the angle that would have saved him, 3 degrees, maybe 4, but no number brought him back. By the time winter reached Luxembourg, I had stopped believing in the permanence of design. Orders still mattered, discipline still built the shell around the chaos. Yet I'd beg *N to sense the cracks in that shell, the delay between a typed directive and the second it met the world. Every rule, no matter how logical, carried an expiration date that no one wrote down. My crew, Corporal Nash on the G*N, Pritchard on the loader, Fenn on the driver's stick, trusted me not because I outranked them but because I treated the tank like an equation that included them. We could solve any problem if each variable held. But even they knew the limits. When the cold seeped through the steel and the radio hissed its static commandments, there were moments when belief thinned. Back in Kansas, I'd once told my mother that machines never lied. In January of '45, I learned they do, quietly, when obeyed too faithfully. I was still Blueprint, still the man who measured before he moved. But in that white valley, numbers froze, and only instinct stayed warm. That was who I was before I broke the rule. The first time I questioned the order, the war was quieter than usual. A gray lull stretched across the Luxembourg hills, too still for comfort. The fog hung low enough to erase the sky, and the trees looked sketched rather than alive. We'd been idle for 3 days, engines turned over only long enough to keep the oil from thickening into tar. Waiting was supposed to mean safety, but every hour of stillness felt like erosion. The no smoke regulation had arrived by courier, one sheet of mimeographed text sealed in plastic, bearing the neat authority of the Ordnance Branch. It wasn't dramatic, just procedural: white phosphorus munitions restricted to marking and illumination. Field use for concealment prohibited pending further notice. Pending further notice meant never. I went to the supply officer anyway. Captain Ellison was a bureaucrat disguised as a soldier, sharp creases, polished boots, and a typewriter where his heart should have been. His office smelled of carbon paper and coffee gone sour. I asked for more WP rounds, kept my tone respectful. He didn't even look up from his forms. "You want smoke?" "What for, Lieutenant, a parade?" I laid the valley map across his desk, tracing wind vectors with a pencil. "One shell here could cover a full withdrawal if we're overrun. The river runs north, smoke would follow it. That buys 2 minutes of blindness." He smirked. "Manual says no. You light that valley and it drifts back on your own boys." "The manual wasn't written for this ground," I said. "Or this wind." His pen paused. "Then maybe you should write your own manual." I folded the map, slid it back into my jacket, and left without another word. Outside, the cold cut through my gloves. Snow fell in fine dust, too light to notice, too relentless to ignore. That night in the Hellcat, the crew stayed silent. Corporal Nash cleaned the breach, Pritchard traced bullet holes on the armor plate where the last firefight had scarred us. None of us spoke about the order, but it hung there like a weight. Men didn't argue with doctrine, they waited for doctrine to get them K*led and then obeyed the next one. The next morning, the fog thickened until visibility fell below 50 yards. I stood outside the tank, watching the river twist through the valley below, the water black as oil. From up there, it was easy to imagine the 3 companies positioned along the bank, their foxholes half frozen, their breath-forming ghosts. If German armor came through that low ground, they'd have nowhere to run. The bridge was already a skeleton of girders. I thought about the manual again, how it warned that WP could drift unpredictably, obscure friendly artillery, cause panic if misread as gas. All true. But it also burned at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, generating dense, fast-rising smoke that no fog or snow could smother. In theory, under the right wind, it could become the perfect shield. I spent that day recalculating trajectories in my notebook. Range, 1,200 yards. Wind, 5 knots east-northeast. Angle of elevation, -3 degrees for airburst. I wasn't planning rebellion, just preparing the math in case disobedience ever became survival. At dusk, a courier jeep crawled past our position, headlights dimmed with mud. The driver tossed us a new packet of orders. Inside, more of the same: hold position, conserve ammunition, await confirmation for any smoke deployment. I read it by lantern light until the ink blurred. Later, Nash muttered, "You think the brass even knows what it looks like down there?" "They know," I said. "They just don't see it." He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't have to. The sound of distant G** fire answered for me, small bursts echoing through the valley, fading under the snow. Each report felt like a question sent upward, waiting for a reply that would never come. That night I realized something I'd never said aloud: the system breaks slower than the men inside it. Orders remain crisp long after fingers go numb. And when they do, you start wondering which will give first, the paper, or the flesh that obeys it. January 12, 1945. Dawn arrived colorless, a diffused gray leaking through cloud and snow. The thermometer on the Hellcat's dash read 12 below freezing. Metal shrank, bolts sang under strain. Every breath felt like inhaling glass. Our platoon was dug in on a ridge overlooking the Shura River, a narrow, black ribbon winding through white hills. The valley floor below was a purgatory of broken equipment and thin hope. 3 rifle companies had been sent to hold the crossing, but the bridge had gone up in flames 2 nights earlier after an artillery strike. What remained were splintered girders pointing skyward, a burnt skeleton dividing 2 worlds. We'd been told reinforcements were coming. "Air support inbound," the message said, clipped and formal. The sky answered with silence. The overcast sat heavy as poured lead, you could taste the snow before it fell. At 0610, Pritchard caught movement in the tree lean across the river, dark shapes slipping between pines. I steadied the periscope. 4 Panthers, wide and low, their armor black with frost. They advanced methodically, as if the cold itself belonged to them. The first shell landed short, 30 yards. The second struck a field ambulance near the riverbank, scattering men and debris into the snow. The explosion painted the fog red for a heartbeat, then white again. The radio came alive, hold position. Artillery adjusting. Air support inbound. The same voice, the same promise. But we'd heard it before, and the sky was still closed. I marked their range, 1,300 yards and closing. At that distance, our 76 mm could bite only if we caught their flanks. But the Panthers weren't hunting us. They were methodical, swinging their G*NS toward the pinned infantry below, cutting them apart like butchers working through bone. Through the lens, I saw men crawling, then not. Corporal Nash exhaled hard. We could draw their fire. Orders say hold, I said. He looked at me, not accusing, just waiting. Orders don't bleed. I wanted to answer, but words turned to frost on my tongue. In the static between bursts of artillery, we heard the human part, the screams that never make it into reports. A medic waving his arms for smoke cover. A runner dragging someone through slush. Each plea rose, cracked, and vanished under the wind. The map on my lap felt obscene, lines and arrows pretending to explain the shape of dying. I lifted the periscope again. The lead Panther was now halfway across the frozen shallows, tracks grinding into the ice. The bridge remnants had become their causeway. I thought about range tables, penetration charts, the perfect angles from training. None of it mattered. Even if we hit one, the others would flank and burn us in seconds. The only P*N we had that could change the entire equation was the one forbidden by sentence and seal, the white phosphorus shell. Inside the Hellcat, the temperature made the air brittle. My breath fogged against the G*Sight. Fenn kept the engine idling low, afraid to stall it. Nash wiped frost from his sight glass, his hands trembling, not from fear but from frustration. We all knew what was coming. At 0630, a stray round from the valley struck a supply truck 50 yards to our right. The explosion scattered crates of rations and medical kits across the snow. Pritchard ducked instinctively. I didn't move. My gaze stayed on the map, the one that told us to hold ground that was already ash. The radio spat again, air support delayed due to weather. Maintain defensive posture. I remember staring at the dial, the needle jumping with interference. The voice sounded calm, detached, safe somewhere behind a desk. I thought of the men below, still moving, still believing that someone above them was watching. Then I realized that we were that someone, and we were watching them die. The decision hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel it forming, like pressure behind glass, waiting for the first crack. Every rule is written for conditions that no longer exist. And when those conditions change, the rule becomes a trap. Outside, the Panthers lined up along the frozen river, G*NS elevating together, silhouettes dark and perfect against the snow. I knew the doctrine, do nothing until ordered. But I also knew the difference between waiting and witnessing. The line between the two was measured in seconds. That morning, on a ridge in Luxembourg, seconds were the only currency left. The shell sat beneath my elbow, white lettering ghosted by condensation, SMK, WP. Officially forbidden. Unofficially, the last unspent possibility left inside that steel box. I could hear the hiss of the engine behind me, steady as breath. In that sound lived the illusion of control, gears, ratios, mechanics, everything I had trusted since Kansas. But war corrodes equations. It reduces all logic to a single line, fire or don't. Through the periscope, the valley was dissolving. Snow turned to vapor where shells landed. The Panthers had advanced halfway across the frozen river now, their silhouettes bending in the heat of their own G*NS. Below them, American helmets flickered in and out of the smoke, shrinking, vanishing. The bridge was gone, the radio was lying, and the rule remained, no smoke, no aid, no interference. If I obeyed, 300 men would die. If I disobeyed, maybe 4 of us would. It felt almost mathematical, equal parts courage and sin. I unlatched the ammunition locker. The metal moaned. Inside, each shell was stamped with its purpose, AP, He, SMK. The WP round looked no different, just duller from handling. I lifted it into the half-light of the turret. Phosphorus, 15 pounds of a substance that burned in air, impossible to extinguish. They said it was unpredictable. So was mercy. Nash saw it first. "Sir, that's forbidden." I nodded. "Then let's forbid them from dying." For a second, no one moved. The decision changed the air, thickened it. Disobedience has a sound, it's the quiet between orders, the intake of breath before history bends. "Load it," I said. Pritchard hesitated, then obeyed. The shell slid into the breech with a hollow click. The motion was automatic, almost reverent. Fenn's gloved hand hovered over the controls, waiting. The snow outside had stopped falling. Even the war seemed to hold still. "Elevation -3, I said softly. Fuse delay half-second. Air burst. Nash met my eyes. "Over the river?" "Over the men." The breech locked shut, a metallic verdict. My mouth was dry. I felt neither brave nor afraid, only exact. Fire. The recoil slammed through the hull, throwing fine powder from every crevice. The shell's trail vanished into fog, a pale line swallowed by the sky. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the valley erupted in light. White phosphorus bursts differently, no flash, no explosion, just a violent bloom. A sphere of incandescent smoke expanded outward, alive, folding over itself like breathing fabric. Within seconds, the entire river vanished beneath a boiling cloud. The glow turned the snow orange, then white again, then nothing but glare. "Jesus," Pritchard whispered. The radio came alive, voices panicked and broken. "What is that? Gas, do we pull back?" I keyed the transmitter. "Negative. Cover. Move under it. West. Now." Static answered, but through it I heard motion, shouts, the rhythm of boots against snow, the chaos of sudden hope. Outside, the Germans hesitated. Through gaps in the smoke I glimpsed figures waving, confused, some retreating from the edge of the riverbank. Someone must have yelled gas. Because the formation fractured. Men dropped masks over faces, Panthers halted mid-aim. In 3 breaths, their discipline melted faster than the ice beneath them. Nash stared at me. "They think it's chemical. Let them." He almost smiled, then remembered what we'd done. Wind picked up from the north, rolling the smoke deeper into the valley, perfect, even, obedient to physics if not to orders. I watched its edge fold along the river like a living map contour, a pattern I had drawn 100 times in notebooks but never seen in motion. 3 minutes of concealment, that was all it would buy. 3 minutes for men to vanish into gray and be reborn somewhere else. I counted under my breath, not from nerves but from habit. 60. 90. 120. Behind me, the crew sat silent, listening to the low thunder of retreating footsteps beyond the fog. We weren't heroes, only instruments misused in the right direction. At 180 seconds, I exhaled. The world was smoke, light, and the faint scent of burning metal. Somewhere inside that chaos, rules were dissolving, turning, like phosphorus, into a fire no order could extinguish. The shell's echo hadn't even faded when the valley disappeared. It was as if the earth had exhaled all at once, a rolling mass of light and vapor that swallowed sound, distance, and shape. For a moment I thought the phosphorus had ignited the fog itself. Then the wind carried it downrange, slow and deliberate, draping the river and the ruined bridge in a curtain of living white. Inside the Hellcat, we could hear nothing but the low, steady heartbeat of the idling engine. Every vibration through the floor felt magnified, every breath audible. I turned the periscope west and saw nothing. The world was gone. "Range?" I asked. "Can't tell, sir," Nash said. His voice was small, careful. "They're blind. We are too." Outside, the Panthers fired blindly into the smoke. One shell screamed overhead, exploded harmlessly somewhere behind the ridge. The shockwave rattled the loose bolts in our turret. Another detonated in the river, sending a hiss of steam skyward. The German G***ners didn't know what they were hitting. The smoke had turned the battlefield into an equation with no variables left. I adjusted elevation by instinct, not sight. High explosive, delay fuse. Target sound, not image. Sound? Pritchard asked. Wherever you hear them breathe. He loaded the shell. We waited. Through the din came the faint metallic grind of treads, the engine growl of a Panther repositioning. I pointed. Nash fired. The sh*T vanished into the white void. 2 seconds later, a dull thump, then nothing. Then, faintly, a secondary blast. Hit, Nash murmured. We didn't cheer. There was no victory here, only calibration. The valley began to move, not the terrain but the shapes within it. Through the haze, American helmets flickered like ghost lights, small figures darting westward. One by one, they disappeared into the smoke. The radio filled with clipped transmissions, barely coherent. Moving under cover. Can't see a thing, keep it coming. Whoever fired that, God bless. Each voice was a pulse of life returning. I turned the periscope again. The phosphorus burned with a steady pulse, a white sun feeding on its own oxygen. The smell reached us even through sealed hatches, sharp, chemical, unforgettable. It coated the tongue, a taste like wet copper. Time? I asked. 2 minutes, 20 seconds since detonation. We had maybe 60 more before the wind shifted. Outside, the Panthers hesitated. One tried to maneuver left, scraping along the burned bridge supports. Its tracks bit into the ice, slipped, caught again. The commander inside must have realized the futility. He fired once more into the fog and reversed, retreating toward the tree-line. Another tank followed, then another. Sir, Nash said quietly, they're pulling back. I didn't answer. Watching through the periscope, I saw the impossible happen, an organized German advance, 4 Panthers strong, dissolving into panic. A single misread signal, smoke mistaken for gas, had undone them more effectively than any ambush. Down below, the last clusters of American infantry were moving westward. Some crawled, some carried the wounded on improvised sleds. They vanished one by one, swallowed by our deception. For a minute, the world existed only in gradients, white smoke, gray silhouettes, black flame. Then the radio crackled again, this time a calm, measured voice from Battalion HQ. Air support delayed indefinitely. Hold current positions. I almost laughed, a sound that came out closer to breath than humor. Current position, I repeated under my breath. We're holding smoke. The phosphorus began to thin. The edges of the cloud frayed into mist. Figures emerged, first Americans, crouched and running, then Germans, scattered, bewildered, scanning through scopes that saw nothing but ghosts. Cease fire, I ordered. We've bought what time we can. For 3 minutes and 40 seconds, reality had bent. We had become invisible. When the smoke finally cleared, the valley lay unrecognizable, the snow pocked with craters, the river choked by half-melted ice, the bridge still burning. But the field was empty of Americans. Only silence remained. Pritchard looked at me, his face pale under soot. You think they made it? They had a head start, I said. That's more than they had 10 minutes ago. Outside, one Panther sat motionless, turret frozen mid-turn, abandoned. The others had withdrawn. The wind moved through the wreckage, stirring ash and phosphorus residue into faint spirals that glowed in the half-light. We had fired one forbidden shell. In return, 3 companies had vanished from death's inventory. Later, when I tallied it all in my notebook, I wrote only a single equation across the page. Smoke armor. That was the battle, not fought, but erased. By noon, the smoke had thinned into ribbons. What was left of it drifted over the river, clinging to the ruins of the bridge like a veil over a corpse. The wind turned, carrying the smell of phosphorus and burned paint back up the ridge. It was metallic, acrid, unforgettable, the scent of something that had never existed in doctrine but had existed, undeniably, here. The valley was silent. No rifle fire, no shouts, no movement, just the occasional groan of contracting steel as the Panthers cooled in the snow. I scanned through the periscope, no Americans, no enemy. The field that had been filled with chaos an hour earlier now held only stillness and smoke ghosts. We waited for counter-battery fire that never came. The Germans, convinced they'd stumbled into gas or artillery, had retreated to regroup. I could picture them in the woods, rubbing eyes, coughing, arguing through masks. They would write their reports later: American forces used gas, impossible visibility, temporary blindness. Command would dismiss them as hysteria. But for us, it had worked. At 1,215 hours, a faint radio pulse reached us through static. All friendly elements west of the river accounted for. Casualties light. Thank you, whoever you are. The voice cut out. 300 men, give or take, had crossed that valley alive. When the new orders arrived by courier at dusk, they felt almost ornamental. Maintain observation. Await reinforcement. No smoke use without command authorization. The last line might as well have been a joke. At 1800, I was summoned to Battalion HQ. The snow crunched under my boots like breaking glass. The temporary command post was a farmhouse with the roof half gone and windows stuffed with burlap. Inside, kerosene lamps burned low, throwing shadows across maps already outdated. Colonel Ashby sat behind a folding table, his coat collar turned up, a cigarette clinging to his lip. "Sit down, Lieutenant." I did. The chair creaked. He slid a report across the table, my own handwriting, forwarded by radio operator from our platoon. The section labeled ammunition expended listed 1 round of type SMKWP. The ink looked as guilty as blood. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. His tone was flat, not angry. Just tired. "You fired prohibited ordnance without clearance." "Yes, sir." "Why?" I thought about the sound the men had made in the valley, the pleading over radio, the arithmetic of seconds and wind. I looked at the colonel and said, "Because the order was late." He stared at me a long time, the cigarette burning down to a trembling ash. Then he wrote something on the report in blue pencil. "Field deviation under extreme conditions." He underlined it once. "That's the phrase we use when we don't have room for argument." I saluted. He didn't return it, just said, "Get back to your tank, Lieutenant. You'll hear more if there's more to hear." There never was. A week later, a fresh manual arrived from higher command, printed in crisp new ink. I flipped to the munitions section out of habit. Between the old prohibitions, someone had inserted a single new clause. Field commanders may authorize smoke for concealment when communication is degraded or observation limited. No author's name. No credit. Just a correction in the machinery. When I read it, I laughed once, quietly, because history had already forgotten the moment it was built from. That's how the system repairs itself, quietly, without confession. Our Hellcat's turrets still bore faint scorch marks from the phosphorus residue. I never scrubbed them off. Every time I ran my hand over the blistered paint, I thought of that white sun blooming over the river, erasing the line between sin and salvation. The crew didn't speak of it. Nash cleaned the G*N like any other day. Pritchard made coffee from melted snow. Fenn fixed the engine mount that had cracked under recoil. Routine returned because routine was survival. But sometimes, at night, the wind carried a faint smell of phosphorus down from the hills, and all of us would pause, just for a second, not meeting eyes, and listen to nothing. That nothing was the sound of 300 men still alive. And though no commendation ever reached our unit, something else did: silence from command, which was its own kind of reward. Silence meant acceptance. Silence meant the war had learned something it would never admit. By then, the front had already moved east, chasing its own logic toward the Rhine. We followed, same tank, same rulebook, one fewer illusion. The shell casing from that day stayed with me. I etched it with a pocketknife when the campaign ended. Not authorized, but necessary. It was the closest thing to truth I ever held in my hands. After the war, I went home to Kansas. The sky there had no ceiling, it opened like an apology. The wheat field stretched so far you could almost believe distance meant freedom. I rebuilt pumps again, quiet, exact, predictable. The tools fit my hands the same way they had before Europe, but my hands no longer trusted stillness. In town, people wanted stories. They asked how it felt to fight, to command, to win. I told them nothing. War, explained aloud, becomes entertainment. Silence preserves its weight. My mother said I had the eyes of someone always measuring something invisible. Maybe she was right. I still found myself calculating wind speed by watching the wheat sway, tracing trajectories in the arc of migrating geese. The mind keeps solving even when there's nothing left to fix. On a shelf above my desk sat the empty shell casing, brass polished dull by time, the letters carved with a pocketknife, not authorized, but necessary. It looked like an artifact from a civilization that had briefly remembered reason. I kept it beside the slide rule I'd carried through training. One measured precision, the other consequence. Every so often I'd receive technical bulletins from the Ordnance Department. The new field manuals were cleaner now, the sentences confident, polished. Buried deep in them was the clause that hadn't existed in 1945, field commanders may authorize smoke under degraded communications. I traced the line with my thumb each time, as if confirming it hadn't been erased. That single sentence was the only monument to what happened in the valley. No one ever wrote my name beside it. That was fine. The correction mattered more than the credit. Doctrine evolves the way rivers do, slowly, carving memory into geography. Sometimes, when I taught young mechanics at the plant, I'd catch them improvising, using a wrench where a gauge belonged, bypassing safety steps for speed. I'd start to reprimand them, then stop. Rules keep systems from collapsing, but only imagination keeps them alive. I learned that under the cold sky of Luxembourg, in a tank made of logic and noise. I tried to live an ordinary life after that, married, buried, built, unbuilt. But war leaves a residue you can't sand away. The smell of oil on hot steel can still twist into phosphorus in my mind. The hiss of a train brake sounds like a shell casing locking into a breach. Every January, when snow covers the plains, I see that valley again, the bridge burning, the smoke rolling west, the men moving under its cover. For years, I dreamed of returning to Europe, to stand where it happened, to see if the river remembered. I never went. Some places are clearer in memory than they can ever be in daylight. In 1953, an army historian visited the plant. He was compiling accounts for a study on tactical innovation. He asked if I had witnessed any notable field deviations during the winter of '45. I looked at him, at the clipboard, at the rows of questions arranged like firing tables. Then I said, "No, sir. None that mattered." He thanked me, shook my hand, and left. 2 years later, a training pamphlet appeared at Fort Knox describing an unauthorized smoke screen that successfully disrupted German armor near the Schur River. The report cited an unidentified tank destroyer platoon leader. I clipped the page and pinned it above my workbench. Not as pride, not as proof, just as evidence that truth sometimes survives anonymity. On quiet nights, when the factory was empty and the only sound was the slow drip of condensation from cooling pipes, I'd hold that shell casing and listen to the metal settle. It clicked faintly as it cooled, like a distant engine ticking after shutdown. In that sound lived the entire war, cold, mechanical, human. I've come to believe obedience is a form of engineering. It builds systems that work until the world shifts beneath them. Disobedience is what keeps the system honest. And somewhere in a valley of snow, long erased by thaw and time, the wind still carries a trace of burned phosphorus, thin, invisible, merciful. A reminder that once, a rule broke itself and called the result salvation. He broke a rule and fooled an entire German division. The smoke that wasn't supposed to exist saved 300 men who were never meant to survive that morning. Official records never spoke his name. The manuals absorbed his defiance, turned it into policy, and filed it under procedure. But in the memory of those who ran through that gray valley, men who saw daybreak through a curtain of fire and mist, he remained the reason they lived. History moved forward on paper, reality moved under smoke. And sometimes the line between cowardice and courage is measured not in orders followed, but in one forbidden shell fired through fog and mercy. In January 1945, obedience would have led them. Disobedience kept them human.